let's focus on the special needs of pediatric and adolescent cancer survivors. So, and what are some of the differences between them?
Thank you. So when we look at survivors, obviously we look at both the age of their diagnosis and the age that they are when they have completed their treatment. But we are looking at a group of young people, pretty wide developmental span. So sometimes for pediatrics, what we find in their survivorship is that they may have gaps in knowledge about their treatment, right? So if their parents are making all their decisions, then when they're surviving and they try to take control over their own medical treatment, even just knowing what happened, what were the agents that I received, what medical interventions occurred, how might that affect my health long term, and how do I take control of that? So anytime you've got somebody who's under the age of consent, because their parents have been consenting all the way along, they have to have a bit of a ramp up in understanding their own health care and taking control of that as an adult or a young adult. So that's one of the first issues. And that can actually be quite difficult because this is occurring at a time when their identity is forming. And so particularly for adolescents, we see that this identity formation is a critical issue that at a time when young people are figuring out who they are, how they fit in the world, maybe who they're going to be when they grow up, they bump into a life-threatening illness. And it's age inappropriate. It's just an off-time occurrence. And therefore, they're different than their peers. And so in some ways, we find young people who have a cancer diagnosis may be more mature than their peers because they've had to face these issues and really wrestle with some existential challenges that perhaps other kids their age have not. And then there are other ways that they might feel like they missed a phase, a developmental stage, and so they survive, they're young adults now and adolescents, and they're perhaps going to a different developmental stage that they missed, and kind of taking on perhaps even risky health behaviors that we wouldn't have anticipated. In addition to that, as we were talking about earlier, just the idea about transitioning back into school can be a real challenge for young people. Now that's across the age spectrum. When you have the younger kids, you want to think about how do we educate the school system to receive these children when they return. And so that's a lot of advocacy even before the kids come back. So if the child has been out of school, then staying connected while they're in treatment so that they don't have to feel so disconnected from their peer group, from their educational attainment goals, and from their teachers. And having some transition, whether it be electronic or even visiting, or some opportunity for them to stay connected. And then as they transition back into school, the school can do some preemptive work, educational sessions with the children who are there about what is cancer? Is it contagious? Can I hurt my friend? Why might they look different? How can I support them? Should I talk to them about it? All those types of questions can be talked about with children at a developmental level, so that before the child even returns, we've done some work with their peer group to help them re-enter that environment. School is the social network for kids, so we have to set that up. And then having them come back in and maybe tell their story if that's what they want. Or maybe this child, let the child have some agency around this. So the child may say, I just want to be treated like a normal kid, quote unquote. I don't want anybody to make a big fuss, just let me fold back in. And another child might say, I really need a moment to explain what happened here, and I need to talk about my experience before I come back in. Working with the child to find out what's best. When we get to adolescence, that becomes even more important, again, because of the developmental identity formation issues, right? So we want to make sure, what I found in my own research and what some of the other research out there supports is that there's an identity paradox around, am I the kid with cancer? Am I the cancer survivor? Or am I just somebody who, I don't want to talk about it, this was part of my experience? And that identity struggle is very big for adolescents. And so we really have to honor their wishes and help them teach us what they need as they re-enter. They also are going to be making some major life decisions in later adolescence about, am I going to college? What does that look like? Do I need some support, either professionally or in an advocacy way in the school, so that I can get all my educational needs met so I'm ready for college? Am I going back into a work environment? Do I need some skills training? How did treatment perhaps impact my cognitive abilities and my peer relationships? So all of those are questions that have to be managed, particularly at the adolescent level.
For cancer professionals, people in the field who may not know how to do it, and including sometimes myself, what's the right language to use in asking those questions of a young person who's been through cancer?
That's a great question. And I do really believe in we start right with the child and adolescent themselves. And we turn to them and we try to take our cancer professional hat off and talk like we would to people, to any people, and say, what do you need? How do you want to be reintroduced into school? Tell me what's important to you. Do you want people, and just really break it down in a very behavioral well. Do you want your classmates to know what happened? Do you want to talk about it? Do you want to just re-enter and have nobody bring it up? Like, what helps you? How can I support you in that? And then from the medical perspective, perhaps saying, what has this experience been like for you? What have you learned about yourself? Even, how have you changed?
Yeah.
Maybe even, how have you grown? Because as we see, in addition to some psychological late effects, which are very well documented, we're seeing lots of evidence of psychological resilience and strength. And I don't think we ask enough about that.
Yeah.
So we should ask that. How have you grown? What have you learned? What do you know about yourself now? Because what we find clinically in the research is that young people say, cancer changed me. And in some ways, I grew and I have strengths I didn't know I had before. Probably would give the learning experience back if I could.
Sure.
But having been here, as I stand on the other side of it, a lot of young people say, I'm different, I'm stronger, I value relationships more, I get who I am, I'm less influenced by peer pressure. All of those types of things can actually be positive psychological outcomes from having had to face such a very difficult experience.
Sure. When you ask little children that, let's say pre-adolescent, what words did they use when you say, how did this experience change you? What was the experience like for you?
Well, you ask them very specifically, what parts were hard?
Yes.
What parts maybe were even easier? Who did you meet? How did you talk to people? Tell me about your cancer, because by that point they're actually quite good at explaining it. So they may be your advocate in teaching the other kids, and even in teaching adults how to talk about cancer, because they'll tell you this happened and I had this experience, and maybe this hurt or it didn't hurt. I was bored.
Yes.
As we know,
Sure.
Cancer treatment actually can be boring
Takes a
because you're in the
long time.
hospital, So if they have a long course of treatment, sometimes they'll say, I was bored, I was lonely, I miss my friends, I'm a little nervous about going back to school. I also find that kids, even really young kids, protect their parents.
Yes.
So a lot of times they'll say, I was worried about my mom. She cried a lot. And I was afraid that I was hurting her because she cried when she came to, she cried when we were here, when we heard something or we talked about it. So
what impact does that have on the parent-child relationship sort of at that time and then moving forward?
That's a great question. And, what we do see is that there can be long-term anxiety and perhaps even traumatic effects for both the child and the parent, and in some cases even more so for the parent. Because if the child was particularly young, it might mean that the parent was holding the anxiety. So after treatment, they're the ones who may have a traumatic reaction, an anxiety reaction. What we hope to do is do that same kind of meaning-making work, or return towards each other and say, how have you gotten closer? How has your family grown? And encouraging the parent and child to talk together about their experience. I tell parents straight up, kids will protect you. They think that if they talk to you and you cry, that they made you cry. So if you cry, go ahead and say, it's okay that I'm crying. I cry because I love you. Like, just put it all out there on the table and let them know that you're there for them. Really enhancing that parent-child relationship. Being curious about the child's experience without trying to, sometimes when our children are suffering, we just want to mitigate it. We want to do something happy and introduce a balloon, and But the child needs to be able to reflect their pain too. And so to say, can you have the capacity to receive both? To let the child tell you what was hard without feeling like you failed as a parent. And then let the child, there might have been parts that were interesting or fun. Maybe they had a great time with a child life specialist and they want to tell you about that. That's good too. But that basically all emotions are okay and all reactions are okay, and that you can receive it. And I also tell parents, find another safe adult who is not their parent, because they may protect you, but they might tell, their history teacher, or they might tell their neighbor, or they might tell their aunt, or they might tell their social worker.
And that's okay.
Yeah.
It's good, actually.
What their feelings are. And in fact, they might be able to do that in a freer way. So pulling that kind of another, I call it a safe adult, into the equation, only supports your child and only supports the parent-child relationship. Doesn't reduce it, it should enhance it.
Yeah. Some of this, it sounds like a lot of challenges. How about for siblings?
Siblings are a really important population, which, as you know, have been overlooked a lot. And so sometimes what happens to siblings is they have been kind of pushed to the side, because if a child has cancer, the family organizes its energy around taking care of this child in crisis. And all the things that happen in a family were going on anyways, trying to get people to soccer, trying to pay the bills, trying to just get through the day. And now suddenly there's this very disruptive, frightening event that has occurred. And so the child who is well, the sibling, may get pushed to the side. And that is also something to normalize and to do some building in relationship around, how do we find a safe adult for that child? How do we keep that child's life as normal as possible? Let them have access to their friends, to their activities. And again, I'm a big believer in transparency and helping the parents say, I know this is hard for you, and I know it's hard for you in a way that's different than your sister. And we love you, and we know that you're being asked to do extra things right now, but we're right here and we love you just as much. Like actually being overt about that communication, because kids can feel kind of isolated and left alone. And they want to be supportive of their sibling, but they may even feel a little resentful depending on their age. And that's normal to feel resentful, but they need someone to talk to too, to say, I feel this, and to have, either someone in their immediate support circle or a professional like a social worker or a child life specialist or somebody who says that's a really normal reaction.
Sure. What can schools do to make the experience as good as possible for childhood cancer survivors and for families and parents too?
I think we go a long way by talking about things and by not hiding things. It's that which we try to push aside that everybody gets frightened of and everybody makes up their own story about. So the more we try to ignore that anything has occurred, I think that makes it harder on kids. So to say to them, if they want that, they should have some control over communication, but that this is, something we can talk about here, that if you need a break from class, here's, kind of your escape plan. Here's how you can take care of yourself. If you want to talk about this, if you don't want to talk about this, let us know and let us support you in that. But sometimes we make decisions for kids and we don't let them have some control over what they want. So the more that we can normalize it and say, we're here to support you in whatever way is best for you.
Talk about long-term issues. So, and whether it be for someone who is treated as a young child, or someone treated with adolescence, what are some of the things they may face as they enter young adulthood and adulthood and other parts of their life?
Well, again, building on this idea about identity, and so a lot of young people that I've worked with and a lot of young people that I know now, young adults, will say, you look at me now and you can't tell that I had cancer. And so now I have a disclosure issue. Like I have to figure out almost when to tell somebody, because it seems like an important part of my story, but do I disclose it when I first meet them? Do I disclose it as our relationship gets closer? If it's an intimate relationship, do I talk about it as we get closer to, increasing intimacy or possibly talking about children? And I've even had young people say, I forgot to disclose it, and then it was awkward, because it seemed like an important part of my story. So I've seen that what young adults there are some young adults for whom it's a part of their story and they need some support in thinking through when and how to disclose to important people in their lives. And then there are other people for whom it becomes a very central part of their identity and they kind of lead with it. And perhaps they create advocacy organizations, perhaps some that the society partners with. There's a lot of great young adult organizations and they lead with that story. So that one of the things is kind of understanding how are they managing the identity, that part of their identity. And then there are issues around school and work and making sure that they have all the support, both socially and skill support to re-enter a work environment or a school environment. There can be issues with peer relationships because of what we talked about before, that they might be in some ways older than their peers or younger than their peers, depending on what happened. And so helping them build healthy, strong peer relationships. And that includes intimate partnered relationships. Issues with sexuality and fertility can come up. So all of those issues, everything that we think about when we think about somebody developing their young life and then to have a life-limiting condition and perhaps a life-altering condition based upon the treatment. So understanding what the physical late effects are, understanding what their risks are for secondary cancers and their health long-term, and then understanding what some of the potential psychological late effects can be and what some of the strengths might be. Having very real in-depth conversations with them about those things so that they get some control over their created life. Who are they going to be next? Who am I now? And how do I want to unfold the rest of my life?
I want to ask you about at-risk behaviors, risky behaviors, because I know that's something you're interested in and done some work on. What do you see are some of the risk-taking behaviors for cancer survivors?
Well, again, if you think about how limiting a cancer treatment can be and how it can pull a young person out of their developmental peer group, sometimes I've seen both clinically and in research where we'll have a young survivor who now is taking on some risky health behaviors. Now, it might be risky health behaviors related to the cancer, i.e. Not managing aspects of their physical health that they know could put them at risk for secondary cancers, or just your general risky health behaviors that your general adolescent might engage in, having to do with anything from drinking or other substances, sexual choices, those types of things, or even just literally taking risks. Now, sometimes that is a revisit to an earlier developmental stage where they say, I actually just didn't even get to experiment with anything because I was in the hospital and I was pretty constrained. I didn't even get to experiment with what I ate, so there's some degree of freedom finding in that. I've also seen some individuals who, it's a little bit of flirting with death. Like, I had part of my life, I feel a little like I had part of it taken from me. So now I'm just going to kind of be right up in the risk phase. I'm just going to go ahead and be risky. This can be alarming for their parents who say, we got you through cancer treatment and now you're, making decisions that could put you at risk. How do we manage that? So that is not an uncommon occurrence, but I think it's also not something that happens in a way. I think it's more likely to be a short-lived occurrence too, unless there are some deeper issues or substance issues that have come up.
And you mentioned sort of long-term psychological issues. Are they common? And what kind of things do you notice?
Well, I think it depends. What we know is that a lot of people do quite well. Even though there are risks, there are certain groups that might be at higher risk. So if somebody has been particularly cognitively impaired by their treatment or any aspect of what they went through in their experience, that's going to put them at higher risk. There are some risk factors, being single, having a lower socioeconomic status, having cognitive impairment due to radiation or treatment of other sorts can put people at higher risk for some of those psychological late effects. But we do see that folks tend to even, survive and thrive, and with some good support, make meaning out of that experience and live very wonderful, healthy, productive lives. But as we've gotten good at taking care of the medical aspects of cancer, I still think we need to pay more attention so that they don't have to figure it out on their own. We can do a better job supporting them.